bring the arts into anthropology and sort of like, you know, prompting us to understand what it means to think with art and to think through art and to respond with art, you know, and stuff like that.
What does it mean when we talk about the as Mokhaphi? And of course, you can relate these two terms because when you think about the idea of twebula, it's to take someone's power, but also it's the visual ritual of making images, right? So it's just about being cognizant of the kind of power that you have as the person who's behind the lens, through the kind of storytelling that you put out there. So interesting, right? Mokhaphi as a fan, I didn't know that until they actually said boys are called abakapeyana, and it's a euphemism. She said that, so for example, if you marry into a family and now as umakoti and there's somebody like an elderly person or you know, like a predecessor whose name is Bafana Bonke or something like that, they no longer have the permission to say Bafana, so they have to say Kapeyan. So, and I use this example even in relation to Princess Magogo, who married into the Buthelezi family. And what I learned is that also when Ndlunkulu marry into particular families, and you find that there's a syllable that can be found in a particular word, but it also refers to a king. So for example, just Ndaba, Nkosi Ndaba, right? So the homestead of Umntwana Magogo is, it's called Wapindangi, right? So there's Nda in that term. So she doesn't say Nda, she says Ncha. You see what I'm saying? So things like Zulu, who was a person, you wouldn't say, as the person now who's a royal woman, you wouldn't say Zulu, you wouldn't say the term, you'd say Bini. So they created like their own language, their own grammar, which is very fascinating. It comes like this book, which was published this year, if I'm not mistaken, called Wandering Hands and Spirited Ink. Snapshots and into the Black public humanities. And in the book, so I have a copy, so I just scanned a couple of pages. So you see that Mushibudi, Mutimele, and Ramato Hassan, who are the editors, have this introduction where they kind of, you know, explain to us what they mean by this idea of Kapa. And they tie it to the late professor and filmmaker Ubhekizizwe Peterson. And as you can see there, it says, in fond memory of Professor Ubhekizizwe Peterson for his timeless and priceless mentorship and fellowship, you have Kaparishtas, Prof. Choma, which is just such a beautiful way of writing within like an academic context, because we are actually like, we are people and we don't sound like our essays. We are, you know, we are just everyday people. So I found that quite interesting. And then of course, when they were working on this project, it was during the pandemic. So there was this idea of social distancing, lockdown and all of that. And so they reflect on Ukapa within this context. So the subtitle says, writing together in isolation before the real distancing. So what they say is, what followed was the isolating process of writing individually, followed by a 2-day in-person collective reading and collective peer reviews of our first drafts, with Professor Peterson as a critical Mokhaphi in the session. And I found it interesting that they not only frame Prof. Peterson as a personal kapayo, but they frame him as someone okapayo, but with the critical mind, with the critical eye, with the critical ear. So I think there's something very powerful there about this idea of a critical Mokhaphi.
One would never go to the shops or to someone's house alone. One always asked someone to kappa you, so that one always had a witness, another's humanity to rub up against one's own. A visitor would never visit by themselves. They always brought their husband or wife, children or extended relatives with them. During the 130-kilometer trips between Butterworth and East London, my mother and father would take every weekend. They always gave a lift to hikers, carrying cardboard signs with the number plates CE for East London, XA for Mthatha, and XB for Tuwa, written out in a blue, black or red ballpoint pen. It was rare not to give someone a lift. These days they carry the same signs, but pay between 30 rands and 50 rands to kappa the driver. Wow. To witness the depth of this concept of ukukapa is difficult sometimes.
In difficult times.
To witness the depth of this concept of ukukapa in difficult times is comforting. At the devastating funeral of a 7-year-old girl I attended 2 months ago, each of the speakers who went up to give tributes and eulogies to the little girl were accompanied by family members, so that nobody stood alone at the podium. Umtu gamye ebe kachwa. Umtu ganye ebe kachwa. I can't see properly, sorry.
Yeah.
Umtu ganye ebe kachwa. When it was her turn to speak, one of the little girl's school teachers, a white woman in her 30s, walked up to the podium alone. Before she began her eulogy, she looked at the packed church and with tears in her eyes told us that in her culture she had never experienced this practice of being accompanied, ukukachwa, in the way that she had witnessed that morning. So she asked a group of fellow teachers to come up to the stage and stand behind her. 3 teachers walked up and held her as she expressed her love for the child. I could hardly see their faces through my own tears, which flowed at this beautiful moment of different cultures touching.
Yeah. This idea of not being an island, and as we know, we have the philosophy of umuntu mabantu that also captures this idea of constantly being coupled. And then she goes on here to also talk about what happens when umakoti leaves the home and how she doesn't go to the mother-in-law's home by herself. She has Mokhaphi as well. So yeah, as I wrap up, yeah, so as I wrap up, thank you for all the work that you've done. You've definitely prompted some of us to think quite deeply about this concept of kaba. Because isn't it, you just take it for granted that it means like it's this one-dimensional thing that means a singular thing, but actually time and time again, whenever I look into concepts found in African languages, I'm always proven wrong, you know. So yeah, thank you so much. And I had written Wits Anthropology. So we can now check out the exhibition.
So they
After it was just released, and so actually it starts in first year where I met Dr. Shange as my first year teacher, and what she just said now, she said it to us in first year, where she says, coming into the institution, don't forget what you know, because the institution is trying to make you get into the lecture hall and leave everything about you behind, right? So from there I started thinking about, you know, how ever since I got to university, my Sesotho vocabulary is going down. Like every time when I'm at home, I can't now speak a sentence without saying because. Or, so like I can't speak without, I just always have to put an English word somewhere, and somehow it's very disturbing, you know, and how sometimes when I'm thinking about something and I find myself thinking about it in English, and I'm like, what's happening, right?
So we went to school, you do everything in English, or for those of us who are unfortunate enough to be at the tail end of apartheid, we had to kind of do Afrikaans. You know, like I was introduced to Afrikaans in high school, like grade 8. Yeah, grade 10 actually. And before then I went to, because I grew up in a homeland, Botswana. So Botswana, your first language was your mother tongue, even in school, and then English was second. So, but unfortunately the school I was at only ended in grade 9. So now I had to go to another school. So now I go to another school and I'm like, hey, you fail Afrikaans, you fail the year. So now I know my father's side of the family was a background in farm labor. Yeah. So now I'm like, you know, you speak Afrikaans because I'm going to speak Afrikaans. So I'm like, okay, you're going to have to teach me this language. But now his approach to it, or his understanding of it was never educational. You know what I mean? It was mostly it was a tool of just existing. But obviously within that as well, we know very well that languages like Tsotsitaal or whatever were developed, came out of us trying to communicate across different cultures in many instances, but also to find new ways of expressing certain things away from the powers that be. And so, you know, there was that limitation on his side, but then, you know, now you have to kind of learn this. You know, not to beat a dead horse, but, you know, I always say language, because really, you know, and maybe living in urban areas makes you more heightened about what's missing, oftentimes, because, you know, when you're here, for the most part, you find that you're speaking English and you don't need to. You know, I always remember one friend of mine saying, you know, when was the last time you thought in your language? And I was like, yeah, that's, you know. Like, you know those old SABC dramas, well, for those who remember with TV1, TV2, TV3. And you know, the character would have a moment where they are having a thought. And you know, they're looking in the distance and this whole monologue going on. You know, and I was like, actually, you know, these are things that sometimes we treat as, oh, it's just entertaining. But really, this is everyday life. You know, I mean, how else do you make sense of things?
So, yeah, for now, because like when I started initially the photography, it just reminded me of like my grandfather saying, you know, and like I was just like constantly. Yeah, but translation. I kiss because that's why I give a and so like I had like there was a constant battle of like how can I translate that visually, you know, like you know, and how can I interpret it in a visual orientation, you know. And so like I also realized like with my family archive there was like a discontinuity of like tradition and particular rituals that were performed, you know, because like certain people passed on and babangwe like they didn't grasp like the idea of like those particular customs, you know. And so for me, like with this body of work or with these symbols that I'm using with this work, is to kind of like create like a continuation of like those particular rituals, of like those particular performances, you know. And also most of us, or like I would say, like we come from a background of like like our we grew up from like our mother's paternal side, you know. And so like I was trying to highlight like the significance. That's how it's cool. So like that's like the reason, like, so that's what I was trying to highlight with like this particular work, like we don't find like these things like written down, you know. And like so for me, like it's for me like to kind of like rewrite those kind of rituals, performances, and like these ideas of as a young man, you also need to be introduced like to your ancestors and to kind of go through that journey, you know, and to kind of navigate what it means to be a black man.
How would you, how do I say this? It's here. How would you, what's your comment on the current photography? Because I would do this like comment just made me think about this. Or, you know, we have been amazing photographers, but you know, we always, or I, you know, we are always very like obsessed with, but how, but why, you know, and stuff like that. So how would you comment on the current photography scenery, and what are your words for us going forward in terms of the South African photography scenery?
I think my parting words would be curious. If you're not curious, you never know.
The photographer was taught to approach ethics, right? So there's this idea in the university that the paper is key, right? So I need to get this person to sign, don't. But like that kind of takes out this whole idea of a conversation and like me connecting with you on a person-to-person level, and that being a form of ethics, right? And also it's like in the work that Kaya is talking about, Kapra Andrew, you know, for him to go into spaces and say, okay, cool, I'm going to photograph the hostel interior, but I'd like the person living here to be absent, because I don't want to make that mistake of making them synonymous to the space, where now we become kind of representations of the ghetto or representations of the hostel. He kind of says, how do I think of this thing as just a thing? And how do I think of the interaction that the person has had with the space as a form of their presence? And as Dr. said quite earlier, this idea of taking a portrait through possessions and objects and what is in space and how we inhabit space. So for me, I'm also interested in how, if we are framing the photographer as Mokhaphi, and we're thinking of Mokhaphi as this weird approach in terms of very natural approach to ethics, I suppose the institution creates difficulties in being able to because there are these limitations in terms of how this can happen. So if I'm referring to my grandmother as a voice that lives within my head, as Uhuru Palafala says, that I'm walking with that matriarchate, and that's the person on Kappa, and I want to draw from that space, I kind of always need to think about how I can do it in a way that's palatable for this space. And I think that's what kind of complicates how that can exist as a concept here, because I think there's a freedom that comes with it in how it's exercised out of the space that is just complicated by the processes that are here, you know. Yeah.
And those processes.
Last year, actually, our master's students went to Tao, and we were looking at how we can reimagine this narrative around the Tao skull. And initially, we printed out consent forms as backup, and then we went there, we met Abokhosi and everything, and we chucked all those things out the window, and we had to speak the language. Even let me not say we, because I didn't understand some of the things that were being said, but those who were well versed in the language, found ways to make it work, So it is happening within anthropology and beyond, actually. I mean, if you think about, and I know Sabelo is not necessarily, within the university space, but his work coming here, he did Lindelo Makola, for example. So those concepts end up finding themselves within the university. And so I think, when I think about just your contemporary black scholar, I think that the work is really happening with people like Babala Mokopana at NMU, talking about ugogo, umakhulu as an institution of knowledge. You think about Unomalanga Mkhize, talking about, Konje, what does she talk about? Unomalanga, I'm just trying to remember this term that she uses. It'll come to me. But there's a Nguni concept that she uses, and she ties it to history making and all of that. So a number of scholars are actually taking the work quite seriously, and we are very cognizant of the fact that these concepts are not ours as well, because Umam Makosa Zanataba said, so you're trying to tell me that now every time I say something Landa, I have to say Atambi the Masona, when actually the word existed before she wrote that article. You know what I mean? And she was asking Uguti, when does an everyday word become field? Because we like to hijack, concepts that have existed for a long time. Next thing, it's according to Shange, this. So yes, it is important to bring these concepts within the university, but at the same time, how do you do it in such a way that you actually don't center yourself as the scholar, and attach yourself to the term? So, for example, having theorized about this idea of Uktwebula in relation to photography, and continuously reminding people that this is not a concept that starts with that particular article, but that actually people have been writing about this, people have been, speaking about this concept in different ways. So there's also a danger, when these concepts make it into these walls, and then all of a sudden it becomes Kholega's concept and all of that, and
coining.
Yeah, this thing of coining, and I like to say, we are actually obsessed with coining things as scholars, and the idea of a kamba, I like to use that concept, kamba, is not specific to, academia. So we also just need to remember that we are just people, In fact, before Prof. Peterson passed away, we attended this conference as part of it was a doctoral conference for the National Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences, NIHSS, and he said, if you really want to change the university, you need to remember the things you knew before you came. Yes. Were you there?
No,
I thought, that change, I wrote it down and I was like, yeah, man. Because you kind of forget yourself, and you start sounding funny when you're here. I still have a problem with this thing of the blackboard, for example. I don't understand it. There's something weird about that expression. But, I got to Wits and I'm like, yeah, it's a black body in. I was like, wait, when does the body then become separate for umoya, from uphefumulo, from personhood? And it just becomes this strange thing. So I guess we also need to critique ourselves as scholars. Okay, you want to bring the concept in, why? And how, because often we are the ones who end up benefiting from it. And it's like, oh, Shange says, and I don't know how I feel about that also. So it's a double-edged sword.